Hi. In this video, I'd like to do something that a lot of people will probably think is outrageous. A complete non sequitur, as it were, which is to celebrate the virtues of studying Latin as a foreign language, especially in high school. The reason why I say outrageous is that according to the 2011 report from the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, only around 2% of students in K through 12 choose Latin as their foreign language. Here are their data based upon the 2007 to 2008 academic year. Furthermore, I find that this statistical reality is frequently reflected in a lot of people's more informal attitudes toward the idea of studying Latin. It's a dead language, they'll say, or it's useless. Or sometimes, who are you going to talk to, the Pope? Anyhow, I should probably begin all of this by taking a minute to describe my own academic journey. I'm currently a 57-year-old American professor of psychology who did take 4 years of Latin in high school during the mid-1970s. So a lot of my observations in this video will be based upon my own first-hand life experience. However, it might also be useful to know that before becoming interested in psychology in the late 1980s, I did 2 degrees in computer science and worked professionally as a software systems analyst for several years. So I've basically had 2 careers in my adult life in 2 very different areas. And finally, it might be helpful to know that I've also studied Spanish and classical Greek along the way. So I've had some experience with studying languages other than Latin. Anyway, in light of all of that, as I reflect upon all of the courses I took in high school, I'd have to say that the 2 areas that have proven to have the greatest enduring value in my adult life would have to be Latin and math. So at this point the question is, what did I learn in my 4 years of high school Latin that has proven to be of worth in adult life, despite the fact that I have not had even a single personal audience with the Pope? I think that the first answer has to do with the fact that when you study Latin, you're learning about how languages work, especially in terms of formal grammatical categories and constructions. In fact, I'd say that personally, I learned a lot more about all of that from my high school Latin classes than I ever did from my English classes. Of course, it's always possible to learn these sorts of things by studying modern languages like Spanish and French. But I've noticed that students who study modern languages rarely seem to end up with the kind of deep understanding of grammar that students of Latin do. I suspect that that's because one of the peculiarities of Latin is that it demands that you know the deep reasons why you're doing what you're doing. In other words, you can't just get by memorizing common expressions and idioms. And of course, gaining a deep understanding of how grammar works can then very easily translate into improvements in our overall command of our native language, such as English. Okay, the second thing that Latin teaches us is a sense for etymology. That is, a sense for how languages shift and change over time, and hence for how English words are themselves bearers of history. For instance, although the statistics vary somewhat, the most common estimate is that around 60% of English words, more or less, derive from Latin, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly by way of the Romance languages such as French, Spanish, and Italian. But the point is that when we study Latin, we're really studying the deep root of large portions of the English language. But why is that important? Well, at the most superficial level, if we want to improve our vocabulary in English, one of the best ways of doing it is to study Latin. However, a much deeper reason is that studying Latin allows us to use English words with a greater appreciation of their subtleties at the level of both denotation and connotation. Basically, studying Latin, and etymology more generally, lends even everyday language a far greater depth than it would otherwise have. It allows us to hear the fugitive echoes of bygone ages sounding and singing in our words, lilting like a faint harmony borne upon the wind of our utterances. Basically, it allows us to appreciate words not merely as utilitarian implements, but as bearers of a subtle kind of magic, as indicators of the beautiful and the miraculous and the holy. And we ourselves, well, at that point we have the chance to become apprentices of that kind of craft, practitioners working to liberate ourselves and each other from the thrall of the prosaic, from the tyranny of having to say dull, predictable things in dull, predictable ways all the damn time. And if you think that that kind of tyranny isn't actually a reality, well, just try turning on the TV sometime. Okay, so let me give you a fairly specific example. One of my YouTube viewers recently commented on my use of the word pusillanimous, which Webster's defines as lacking courage and resolution, or marked by contemptible timidity. However, you students of Latin will probably recognize that pusillanimous derives from two Latin words, pusillus, which means small, tiny, or insignificant, something like that, and animus, which means mind or soul. So etymologically, to be pusillanimous is to have a animus pusillus, a small soul or tiny mind. And studying Latin allows us to hear both meanings at once, the denotative meaning of lacking courage and resolution, and the connotative, evocative motif of having a small soul. But while there's a value inherent to being able to use language in this deeper, more poetic way, as well as a value to liberating ourselves from the thrall of the prosaic, the real point is ultimately to become deeper and more poetic beings ourselves. In other words, the whole point of deepening our sensitivity to language is to deepen our souls, and hence to deepen our experience of life itself. So, in its further reaches and manifestations, studying Latin is actually about transforming our lives themselves. The real point is to start to become poetic in our being, to become poetry made flesh, ourselves. However, studying Latin and feeling the pull of that kind of transformation also involves becoming more intimately acquainted with the larger arc of human history and our place within it. In addition to purely linguistic considerations, when we study Latin, we also come into contact with an ancient world and an ancient way of being. I remember that as a teenager, I was endlessly fascinated by that. I remember being completely entranced and enchanted with the idea that I was actually reading the original words of Caesar and Cicero and Ovid and Virgil, hearing the echoes of human voices from 2,000 years ago. It was uncanny to me and magical. It was like I was time traveling in a way. And so, if I may be so bold as to inject a little something from the canon of Doctor Who, and I'm not sure that I can say it better than that. When we become time travelers, perhaps by studying an ancient language like Latin, it changes the way we see the universe. And at the end of the day, what could be a better adventure than that? So, why study Latin? Well, at an immediate practical level, it improves our understanding of basic English grammar and vocabulary. In fact, far better than actual English classes do, at least in my experience. Furthermore, it invites us to use English words with a much greater understanding of their etymological underpinnings and hence a greater appreciation of their evocative poetic power. This is important not only in its own right, but insofar as it can serve as an entry into experiencing the moments of our lives as something poetically luminous and perhaps also poetically numinous. And finally, studying Latin brings us into the larger ambit of Western history and can occasion a more profound sense of participation in it, which in turn can be a way of deepening our experience of life itself, both individually and collectively. And finally, as a consequence of all of this, studying Latin can be a way of learning to perceive the inherent magicality of life itself and changing the way we see the universe. And perhaps in the process, we can even learn to live with a much greater sense of adventure and a greater cognizance of how miraculous our lives really are. Not a bad bargain for 4 years of high school classes, is it? Okay. Thanks for watching. Peace out.